We've all heard the usual war stories, battles, tanks, and prisoners behind barbed wire. But what if I told you that thousands of captured Italian soldiers in World War II found themselves in America, and every single Sunday they were sitting inside a chapel hearing Mass, singing hymns and praying. Just like back home, crazy right? Because when you picture P camps you don't imagine choirs, priests, and communities gathering in worship. You imagine misery, you imagine punishment. You imagine silence, and here's the shocker: some of these men couldn't even believe it was allowed. They thought religion in the enemy's land would be mocked or forbidden. Instead, they found something that rattled them to their core: freedom of faith right there in captivity. For many, it was the first time they understood what America truly stood for, and it wasn't just tanks and bombs. This isn't a fairy tale. This happened in dusty barracks and makeshift chapels. Italian PSWs discovered that their captors treated their souls as seriously as their stomachs. Historians have dug up letters, diaries, and even photographs proving just how real these Sunday gatherings were. And wait until you hear the rest, because those masses didn't just stay inside the camp, they spilled over into American towns, into friendships, into connections that no one ever expected. Some prisoners went back to Italy with an entirely new vision of the country they had been told was their enemy. So buckle up, because this is not another war story about destruction. It's about faith, humanity, and how Catholic Mass every Sunday turned enemy soldiers into something far more complicated. When Italy surrendered in September 1943, tens of thousands of Italian soldiers suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of the battlefield, captured by the Allies in North Africa, Sicily, and later mainland Italy. These men were shipped across the Atlantic to a place they never expected to see: the United States of America. Imagine the feeling boarding a massive troop transport guarded by Americans, not knowing whether you were heading to years of misery or to something worse. For most of these prisoners, the word captivity conjured up dark images of starvation and cruelty, because that's what fascist propaganda had hammered into them about what would happen if they fell into enemy hands. By the end of the war, America was holding nearly 400,000 Italian prisoners of war, scattered in camps across more than 40 states. The first major groups arrived in late 1943 after the collapse of Mussolini's regime. They were unloaded in ports like Norfolk, Virginia, or New York City, and then sent inland by train. The prisoners saw landscapes they'd only heard of in movies or books: the rolling corn fields of the Midwest, the wide open plains of Texas, the forests of the Carolinas. Some of them admitted later in diaries that the train rides were the first time they realized America was not just skyscrapers and Hollywood, but an enormous, varied land. The arrival at the camps was another shock. Instead of the dungeons they had braced for, many found neat rows of wooden barracks, mess halls, recreation fields, and this was stunning to them: libraries and chapels. They were issued clean uniforms marked PW for prisoner of war, given 3 hot meals a day, and even medical checkups. The Geneva Conventions, which the U.S. had pledged to follow, guaranteed decent treatment, but to the average Italian foot soldier, this was far beyond expectation. In fact, many later admitted they were better fed as PSWs in America than they had been as active soldiers in Mussolini's crumbling army. The guards, too, were not what they anticipated. Instead of constant beatings or threats, most American camp guards were professional and distant, but not cruel. Some spoke Italian, others learned phrases to communicate, and over time, a kind of rough rapport grew. Prisoners were put to work in non-combat roles: farm labor, construction, logging, earning small wages they could use in the camp canteen. It was work, yes, but also freedom compared to sitting in a cell. Still, the most unexpected surprise wasn't the food or the pay or even the movies they were allowed to watch in camp theaters. It was the space set aside for religion. In nearly every large camp, chaplain, both Catholic and Protestant, were assigned to minister, not just to American soldiers but also To the prisoners, for Italians overwhelmingly Catholic, this meant something unimaginable, even behind barbed wire. They would not be denied their Sunday Mass. This first encounter with the American approach to faith planted the seed for what would become the most talked about memory of their captivity. Soldiers who had expected humiliation instead found themselves lining up in camp chapels preparing to sing hymns, confess their sins, and hear sermons in their own language. Before any of that unfolded, though, it started here with the shock of arriving in the United States and realizing captivity was not the nightmare they had been taught to fear. Life inside the camp settled into a rhythm, one that surprised many Italian prisoners with how structured yet humane it was. Each day began early, usually with a roll call where guards counted men in neat formations. Afterward came breakfast: eggs, oatmeal, bread, sometimes even bacon or pancakes, for soldiers who had marched through North Africa on half rations of stale bread. This food seemed almost unreal. Some prisoners later joked that captivity in America was the first time they had tasted a proper American breakfast. Work was central to daily life, according to the Geneva Conventions. PSWs could not be forced into war-related industries, but they could be assigned to non-combat labor. In states like Texas, Nebraska, and Iowa, Italian prisoners worked the fields, harvesting crops that local farmers desperately needed during wartime labor shortages. Others repaired roads, chopped timber, or built storage facilities. In exchange, they received coupons or small wages which could be spent at the camp canteen on cigarettes, toiletries, or sometimes even candy. The idea that a prisoner could earn money for his own comfort was deeply foreign to men raised in the rigid fascist military system. Recreation filled the hours not spent working. Many camps had soccer fields, and since Italians were passionate about the sport, matches became lively weekend events. Prisoners also organized music ensembles, painting clubs, and even theatrical performances. Some camps ran educational classes where PS could learn English, mathematics, or mechanical skills. The Red Cross provided books, and chaplain arranged for religious reading material in Italian. This combination of discipline and freedom created a routine that, while still captivity, gave life a sense of normality. The physical layout of camps also played a role in shaping this experience. Barbed wire and guard towers reminded everyone they were still prisoners. Yet inside the perimeter, barracks were heated, beds had blankets, and showers worked regularly. In diaries preserved after the war, Italians often remarked that their accommodations compared favorably to the cold, crumbling barracks they had lived in. Back in Italy as active soldiers, the contrast was striking. The enemy's prison felt more humane than their own army's barracks. One thing that deeply unsettled them was the freedom American civilians seemed to enjoy just beyond the wire. Many camps were located near small towns, and prisoners could see families driving cars, attending church, or going to school. This glimpse of American life, ordinary, unbroken by war, made them reflect on the bombings and shortages their families endured back home. It was both comforting and painful, but amid all the routines of work and play, something stood out above all else: the fact that every Sunday the camp halted for worship. Soccer games were paused, work assignments suspended, and barracks quieted. Chaplain would arrive, sometimes American priests fluent in Italian, other times fellow prisoners who had been ordained before the war. In makeshift chapels or even in open-air gatherings, Mass was conducted. For men who had grown up in villages where Sunday worship was as natural as breathing, this restored a rhythm that captivity had threatened to erase. That ritual of pausing life for worship became the heartbeat of camp existence. It transformed captivity from mere survival into something deeper, a place where faith, routine, and even hope could survive behind the fences. It was not what Mussolini's soldiers had expected when they surrendered, but it was quickly becoming one of the defining features of their time in America. The first Sunday inside a camp was a revelation for many Italian prisoners. After days of adjusting to their new reality, uniforms marked with PW, the Clang of muskets, the hum of English words they barely understood, they suddenly found themselves invited to gather for worship. Chaplain appointed by the U.S. Army set up simple altars inside wooden barracks or outdoors under tents, across a few candles, sometimes flowers from the camp garden, nothing elaborate but enough to transform the space into something holy. For Italian soldiers raised in villages where the church bell dictated daily life, this was extraordinary. They had prepared for hunger, cold, or punishment, but not for this, a chance to kneel, make the sign of the cross, and hear Mass in their own language. The American military understood that religion was central to prisoner morale. Catholic priests, some of them Italian Americans fluent in the language, traveled to camps each week. In places like Camp Hereford in Texas or Camp Adterbury in Indiana, entire barracks were converted into chapels, their walls adorned with donated icons or hand-painted images made by the prisoners themselves. The masses followed a familiar structure. Hymns in Latin rose from voices that cracked with emotion, reminding the men of churches back home. The priest's sermon often touched on universal themes: peace, forgiveness, endurance, deliberately avoiding politics. Then came communion, the most intimate ritual of all, where prisoners lined up to receive the host. For men who thought their souls might be forgotten behind barbed wire, this sacrament felt like a lifeline. Some camps even arranged special feast days. On Christmas Eve 1943, prisoners at a camp in Oklahoma decorated a barrack with pine branches and makeshift ornaments. The chaplain led midnight mass while the men sang Adest Fideles. In that moment, the war outside seemed to pause. One diary entry recalled, "We sang as if we were back in Naples. For one night, captivity was forgotten." These gatherings also had a unifying effect inside the camp. Not every prisoner had been a devout Catholic back in Italy. Some were lukewarm believers, others skeptical. But in captivity, faith took on new meaning. Even men who rarely attended Mass at home found themselves joining the crowd, drawn not only by ritual but by the sense of belonging it gave. The Mass wasn't just worship, it was identity. It reminded them they were Italians, men of faith, not just anonymous prisoners stamped with PW. The American chaplain, for their part, often marveled at the devotion they witnessed. They noted how seriously the Italians prepared, dressing neatly, even shining their boots before attending. Some priests encouraged prisoners to form choirs or help serve at the altar. Slowly, Sundays became not just another day in captivity, but the highlight of the week, the one time when the fences seemed to fade, replaced by a connection to God, home, and each other. The existence of these services was more than just religious tolerance. It was a quiet, powerful statement that even in war, America would not strip prisoners of their souls. For Italians expecting mockery or repression, this realization shook them. They had not expected to find faith flourishing in a land that fascist propaganda had painted as godless and materialistic. Yet here they were every Sunday, living proof that those warnings had been lies. For many Italian prisoners, the biggest shock wasn't simply that Sunday Mass was allowed inside the camps. It was that their captors encouraged it. Fascist propaganda back home had drilled into their heads that America was a land of corruption, greed, and moral decay. They were told Americans worshipped money, not God, and that prisoners would be stripped of their dignity, maybe even their religion. Instead, they discovered the opposite. Behind barbed wire in places like Texas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma, they could openly worship without fear. This freedom of religion stood in stark contrast to what many had seen in Europe during the war years. In Mussolini's Italy, the Catholic Church had a complicated relationship with the regime. Public worship existed, of course, but it was often entangled with politics used to reinforce loyalty to the state. Priests who criticized fascism risked harassment, and many sermons subtly praised Mussolini as a protector of faith. In Nazi-occupied territories, things could be even worse. Religion was sometimes suppressed, censored, or twisted to serve propaganda. Italian soldiers knew of this reality, and many assumed that in enemy hands they would be cut off from the sacraments altogether. So when American chaplain welcomed them to Mass, it felt almost unreal. Imagine kneeling in a camp chapel looking up at an American priest who spoke Italian fluently, blessing you, handing you communion, and asking nothing in return. For men who had lost everything, freedom, rank, dignity, it was a restoration of something vital, their humanity. Some PS wrote in letters home that they had never expected such treatment. To them, it was proof that America was not just fighting with guns but with ideals. The shock deepened when they realized worship was not monitored for loyalty or political content. No officer demanded that priests preach in favor of Roosevelt. No soldier stood in the back taking notes. The Mass was simply Mass. Pure, unfiltered worship, in an era when even in their homeland religion was sometimes colored by politics. This neutrality amazed them. Prisoners also began to sense a deeper lesson in what they were experiencing. In the eyes of their captors, they were enemies. Yet in the eyes of God and in the freedom granted by America's system, they were still men entitled to their faith. That message worked quietly but powerfully on their understanding of the enemy. Instead of cruelty, they saw tolerance. Instead of mockery, they saw respect. This revelation rippled outward. Some Italian PSWs, once deeply loyal to fascism, began rethinking what they had believed. If their enemy treated them with such dignity, what did that say about Mussolini's warnings? Could it be that the so-called godless Americans were in fact defending values closer to true Christian principles than fascism ever had? The shock of religious freedom in captivity became one of the most profound memories these men carried home. Diaries and oral histories recorded after the war often linger on this detail more than food or work. For men shaped by Catholic traditions, faith was not a small privilege. It was the core of identity, and to have it preserved, even nurtured by an enemy nation, was a shock they would never forget. As the war dragged on, something remarkable began to happen in certain camps. Italian prisoners were not just attending Mass inside the barbed wire, but sometimes in nearby American towns. Local communities, many of them heavily Catholic, extended invitations to the chaplain and prisoners alike. On Sundays, a small group of PSWs escorted by guards might be marched through town streets to the parish church, where they joined ordinary Americans for worship. For men who had been told they were hated enemies, this was almost surreal. Take, for instance, Camp Atterbury in Indiana. Oral histories tell us that some Italian prisoners were allowed to worship in local parishes sitting just pews away from American families. There was no hostility in these sacred spaces, rather curiosity and even warmth. American parishioners would glance at the men in their PW uniforms, whisper among themselves, but once the Mass began, all eyes turned to the altar. In that moment, the boundary between prisoner and free man blurred. Both knelt, both prayed, both repeated the same words in unison. This shared faith sometimes blossomed into small but meaningful exchanges. After Mass, parishioners would shake hands with the Italians, offer them rosaries, or even invite them to share coffee and bread outside the church. Guards often allowed it, seeing no harm in brief human contact. Some Italian PSWs later remembered these moments as the most astonishing of their captivity, when supposed enemies treated them as brothers in Christ rather than foreign soldiers. The Red Cross and local Catholic organizations also played a role. They donated prayer books and Italian religious medals and hymnals to the camps. In some cases, parish priests worked with camp chaplain to coordinate feast day celebrations. Easter and Christmas became especially powerful moments, with choirs combining P voices and American parish voices. The symbolism was undeniable. In the darkest years of global conflict, faith built bridges across enemy lines. It wasn't always smooth, of course. Some Americans distrusted the idea of allowing enemy soldiers into their churches. Families who had lost sons in Italy or North Africa sometimes resented the generosity shown to PSWs, but more often than not, shared Catholic identity outweighed bitterness. Italian prisoners were seen not as Mussolini's pawns but as fellow Believers caught up in a war none of them had chosen. These encounters often left a deep impression on the prisoners. For men used to fascist slogans and wartime suspicion, stepping into a church filled with civilians who welcomed them if only for an hour was disarming, one former P later said. When I walked into that American church, I was no longer a prisoner, I was a man again. The memory of these shared masses followed many back to Italy. When they told their families about America, they didn't just describe food or barracks life, they told of the kindness of strangers, of the shock of praying beside the enemy, of discovering a vision of faith unbroken by politics or hatred, and in those recollections, seeds of post-war friendship between Italy and America quietly took root. Even when Italian prisoners attended Mass inside the camps, there was no escaping the subtle culture clash. Between their traditions and those of American Catholics, the foundation of the liturgy was the same: Latin prayers. Familiar hymns, the structure of the Mass unchanged, but the style, the atmosphere, even the music often felt different for Italians raised in small village parishes where churches echoed with centuries-old chants and incense hung in the air. The American version could feel strangely plain. In places like Texas or Nebraska, the chapels inside camps were often simple wooden halls, instead of ornate marble altars. There might be a table draped in white cloth, instead of frescoed ceilings, bare rafters. To Americans, this simplicity was practical. To Italians, it was jarring. One diary recalled, "It was Mass, yes, but without the soul of our churches at home." Yet despite that disappointment, the essence of the ritual was intact, and that was enough to comfort most prisoners. Music provided another point of difference. Italian Catholics were used to expressive hymns, often with choirs that filled village squares on feast days. In America, Mass leaned more toward straightforward hymns, sometimes accompanied by an organ or even no music at all. PWS often stepped in to form choirs themselves, filling the gaps with familiar songs from home. Some camps even encouraged this, providing sheet music and practice time. The result was an odd but beautiful blend: Latin liturgy conducted by American chaplain, accented by Italian voices singing with passion. Customs too revealed contrasts. In Italy, religious festivals were celebrated with processions, bells, and public displays. In the camps, such outward expressions were limited by circumstance. A few chaplain allowed small processions within the barbed wire, prisoners carrying handmade statues or icons around the compound. Guards sometimes watched in amusement, unsure what to make of the pageantry, but to the Italians, these moments brought a slice of home into captivity. Confession also revealed cultural differences. Many Italians were used to confessing to priests who knew their families, their villages, their personal histories. In America, confessions were often given to chaplain who were strangers, sometimes even Americans with heavy accents. Some prisoners hesitated at first, worried they couldn't open up to a foreigner, but over time they adapted, and in some cases the distance made confession easier. They could speak freely, unburden themselves without fear of gossip traveling back home. Even small gestures carried weight. Italian prisoners were astonished to see American chaplain treating them with equal dignity to U.S. soldiers. The sacraments were distributed without distinction. There was no separate line for prisoners, no withholding of communion. To men expecting to be degraded, this equality felt profound. Not every prisoner embraced the experience. Some remained distant, unsettled by the differences. A handful muttered that these were American masses lacking the warmth of home. Yet the majority adapted, finding comfort in the common ground of shared faith. The culture clash did not erase the ritual. It enriched it, and in adapting to a new way of worship, prisoners discovered something unexpected: that Catholicism, though expressed differently in America, still bound them to a larger universal church. The result was a slow but steady shift in perspective. The more they prayed in these chapels, the more they realized that what united them with their captors ran deeper than what divided them, and that realization would grow stronger in the days after Mass. When faith spilled over into human connection beyond the chapel walls, when the last hymn faded and the priest gave his blessing, Mass did not simply end. For Italian prisoners, the hours afterward often became the most human part of the week. Faith had opened a door, and through it flowed gestures of kindness that softened the harsh outlines of captivity. Inside the camps, it began with simple exchanges. After Mass, American chaplains sometimes lingered to chat, practicing their Italian or encouraging prisoners to ask questions. Guards, usually distant, occasionally shared cigarettes or candy. Fellow prisoners passed around bread saved from their rations or small tokens, like hand-carved rosaries made in the workshops. The atmosphere was calmer, warmer, as though the collective act of worship had momentarily erased the boundaries of barbed wire. Outside the camps, the effect was even stronger. In towns where PSWs attended local churches, parishioners often stayed afterward to speak with them. Mothers pressed baked goods into their hands, children offered handshakes or witty stares, and priests sometimes invited them to join parish meals. While still under guard, the Italians were allowed to taste something rare: community. They were no longer anonymous enemies, but men with names, stories, and families waiting back home. Some friendships took root in these moments. Prisoners began exchanging letters with American parish families, carefully censored by authorities but still deeply meaningful. These pen-pal relationships sometimes endured long after the war ended. A few former PS even returned to America years later to visit the families they had met through church. In interviews decades later, many remembered these bonds more vividly than the work or the food. The rituals of shared humanity extended to holidays as well. On Christmas, towns near camps often organized gift drives for PS. Packages of warm clothes, prayer books, and sweets made their way into the hands of men who had expected only deprivation. One Italian prisoner recalled the astonishment of receiving a knitted scarf from an American family he had never met. In that moment, he wrote, "The war disappeared, there was only kindness." Faith also offered opportunities for forgiveness, though quietly and slowly. Some prisoners wrestled with guilt over fighting for Mussolini, others with bitterness over being captured. Yet when they knelt beside Americans at the same altar, those emotions shifted. Shared prayer reminded them that their captors were not monsters but fellow believers. One former P later described it as the first time I saw the enemy as human. Of course, not every interaction led to friendship. Some Americans remained hostile, unwilling to see past the uniforms. Some prisoners clung to suspicion, convinced generosity was a trick. But enough bridges were built that the overall memory of captivity was colored not just by fences and labor, but by humanity. The most powerful part of this legacy was its endurance. Long after the war ended, letters, memoirs, and oral histories revealed how deeply these Sunday gatherings had shaped the men. Many credited them with restoring hope, dignity, and a sense of belonging when they had expected nothing but loss. Through faith, captivity became more than survival. It became a lesson in shared humanity, one that many Italian soldiers carried with them for the rest of their lives. When the war finally ended in 1945 and ships began carrying Italian prisoners back across the Atlantic, many of them left America with something more than memories of barracks and work details. What stayed with them most vividly was the rhythm of Sundays. The sound of hymns rising in wooden chapels, the sight of priests lifting the host, the warmth of strangers who welcomed them into their parishes. In letters and memoirs written years later, they often recalled these moments as the turning point in how they saw America. For soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to Mussolini, the experience of worshipping freely behind barbed wire left a lasting impression. They realized that the enemy they had been told to hate was a country where dignity, even for prisoners, was preserved. That realization softened hearts and reshaped minds. Many returned home convinced that America was not just powerful militarily but powerful in ideals. This legacy influenced relationships long after the war. When Italy officially switched sides in 1943, joining the Allies against Germany, the foundation for friendship had already begun to form, but the personal experiences of PS gave that alliance deeper meaning. They carried home stories of kindness, of freedom of religion, of discovering that their faith was not only tolerated but supported. These stories spread through villages and towns across post-war Italy, creating a new understanding of America among ordinary people. Historians note that many of these prisoners became bridges between the two nations. Some used the English they had learned in camp schools to work with American businesses after the war. Others maintained pen pal friendships with American families, exchanging photos of children and grandchildren for decades. A few even returned to the United States permanently, drawn back by the connections first formed during Sunday Mass in captivity. The legacy also rippled into broader Catholic history. The sight of enemy soldiers worshiping freely in America during the war years became part of a larger narrative of religious liberty. It stood in sharp contrast to the repression and manipulation of religion in fascist and Nazi Europe. For the Church, it was a reminder that faith could flourish even in unlikely places like P camps surrounded by barbed wire. Decades later, oral histories collected from former Italian PS still circle back to those Sundays. They remembered the soccer games, the food, the working fields, but above all, they remembered kneeling in prayer, feeling human again. One veteran summed it up simply: I expected chains, instead I found God waiting for me in America. The story of Italian prisoners attending Catholic Mass every Sunday in America is more than a wartime anecdote. It is proof that even in an age defined by brutality, humanity endured. Barbed wire could not cage faith, labels of enemy could not erase shared belief, and in the quiet rituals of worship, men discovered that what bound them together was far stronger than the war that had torn them apart.